Chapter 24. Lost. No words in any human language can depict my utter despair. I was literally buried alive, with no other expectation before me but to die in all the slow, horrible torture of hunger and thirst. Mechanically, I crawled out, feeling the dry and arid rock. Never to my fancy have I ever felt anything so dry. But, I frantically asked myself, how had I lost the course of the flowing stream? There could be no doubt it had ceased to flow in the gallery in which I now was. Now I began to understand the cause of the strange silence which prevailed, when I tried if any appeal from my companions might perchance reach my ear. It so happened that when I first took an imprudent step in the wrong direction, I did not perceive the absence of the all-important stream. It was now quite evident that when we halted, another tunnel must have received the waters of the little torrent, and that I had unconsciously entered a different gallery. To what unknown depths had my companions gone, and where was I? How to get back? Clue or landmark there was absolutely none. My feet left no signs on the granite and shingle. My brain throbbed with agony as I tried to discover the solution of this terrible problem. My situation, after all sophistry and reflection, had finally to be summed up in 3 awful words. Lost, lost, lost! Lost at a depth which to my finite understanding appeared to be immeasurable. These 30 leagues of the crust of the earth weighed upon my shoulders like the globe on the shoulders of Atlas. I felt myself crushed by the awful weight. It was indeed a position to drive the sanest man to madness. I tried to bring my thoughts back to the things of the world so long forgotten. It was with the greatest difficulty that I succeeded in doing so. Hamburg, the house in the Conte Grasse, my cousin Gretchen, all that world which has before vanished like a shadow, floated before my now vivid imagination. There they were before me, but how unreal. Under the influence of a terrible hallucination, I saw all the incidents of our journey pass before me, like the scenes of a panorama. The ship and its inmates, Iceland, M. Fridriksson, and the great summit of Mount Sneffels. I said to myself that, if in my position I retained the most faint and shadowy outline of a hope, it would be a sure sign of approaching delirium. It were better to give way wholly to despair. In fact, did I but reason with calmness and philosophy, what human power was there in existence able to take me back to the surface of the earth, and ready too to split asunder, to rend in twain these huge and mighty vaults which stand above my head? Who could enable me to find my road and regain my companions? Insensate folly and madness to entertain even a shadow of hope. "Oh, uncle," was my despairing cry. This was the only word of reproach which came to my lips, for I thoroughly understood how deeply and sorrowfully the worthy professor would regret my loss, and how in his turn he would patiently seek for me. When I at last began to resign myself to the fact that no further aid was to be expected from man, and knowing that I was utterly powerless to do anything for my own salvation, I kneeled with earnest fervor and asked assistance from heaven. The remembrance of my innocent childhood, the memory of my mother, known only in my infancy, came welling forth from my heart. I had recourse to prayer. And little as I had a right to be remembered by him whom I had forgotten in the hour of prosperity, and whom I so tardily invoked, I prayed earnestly and sincerely. This renewal of my youthful faith brought about a much greater amount of calm, and I was enabled to concentrate all my strength and intelligence on the terrible realities of my unprecedented situation. I had about me that which I had at first wholly forgotten, 3 days' provisions. Moreover, my water bottle was quite full. Nevertheless, the one thing which it was impossible to do was to remain alone. Try to find my companions I must, at any price. But which course should I take? Should I go upwards, or again descend? Doubtless it was right to retrace my steps in an upward direction. By doing this with care and coolness, I must reach the point where I had turned away from the rippling stream. I must find the fatal bifurcation or fork. Once at this spot, once the river at my feet, I could, at all events, regain the awful crater of Mount Sneffels. Why had I not thought of this before? This at last was a reasonable hope of safety. The most important thing then to be done was to discover the bed of the Hansbach. After a slight meal and a draught of water, I rose like a giant refreshed. Leaning heavily on my pole, I began the ascent of the gallery. The slope was very rapid and rather difficult, but I advanced hopefully and carefully, like a man who at last is making his way out of a forest, and knows there is only one road to follow. During 1 whole hour nothing happened to check my progress. As I advanced, I tried to recollect the shape of the tunnel. to recall to my memory certain projections of rocks, to persuade myself that I had followed certain winding routes before. But no one particular sign could I bring to mind, and I was soon forced to allow that this gallery would never take me back to the point at which I had separated myself from my companions. It was absolutely without issue, a mere blind alley in the earth. The moment at length came when, facing the solid rock, I knew my fate, and fell inanimate to the arid floor. To describe the horrible state of despair and fear into which I then fell would now be vain and impossible. My last hope, the courage which had sustained me, drooped before the sight of this pitiless granite rock. Lost in a vast labyrinth, the sinuosities of which spread in every direction, without guide, clue, or compass, I knew it was a vain and useless task to attempt flight. All that remained to me was to lie down and die. To lie down and die the most cruel and horrible of deaths. In my state of mind, the idea came into my head that one day perhaps, when my fossil bones were found, their discovery so far below the level of the earth might give rise to solemn and interesting scientific discussions. I tried to cry aloud, but hoarse, hollow, and inarticulate sounds alone could make themselves heard through my parched lips. I literally panted for breath. In the midst of all these horrible sources of anguish and despair, a new horror took possession of my soul. My lamp, by falling down, had got out of order. I had no means of repairing it. Its light was already becoming paler and paler, and soon would expire. With a strange sense of resignation and despair, I watched the luminous current in the coil getting less and less. A procession of shadows moved flashing along the granite wall. I scarcely dared to lower my eyelids, fearing to lose the last spark of this fugitive light. Every instant it seemed to me that it was about to vanish and to leave me forever, in utter darkness. At last, one final trembling flame remained in the lamp. I followed it with all my power of vision. I gasped for breath. I concentrated it all on the power of my soul, as upon the last scintillation of light I was ever destined to see, and then I was to be lost forever in Cimmerian and tenebrous shades. A wild and plaintive cry escaped my lips. On earth, during the most profound and comparatively complete darkness, light never allows the complete destruction and extinction of its power. Light is so diffuse, so subtle, that it permeates everywhere, and whatever little may remain, the retina of the eye will succeed in finding it. In this place, nothing. The absolute obscurity made me blind in every sense. My head was now wholly lost. I raised my arms, trying the effects of the feeling beginning against the cold stone wall. It was painful in the extreme. Madness must have taken possession of me. I knew not what I did. I began to run, to fly, rushing at haphazard in this inextricable labyrinth, always going downwards, running wildly underneath the terrestrial crust, like an inhabitant of the subterranean furnaces, screaming, roaring, howling, until bruised by the pointed rocks, falling and picking myself up all covered with blood, seeking madly to drink the blood which dripped from my torn features, mad because this blood only trickled over my face, and watching always from this horrid wall, which ever presented to me the fearful obstacle against which I could not dash my head. Where was I going? It was impossible to say. I was perfectly ignorant of the matter. Several hours passed in this way. After a long time, having utterly exhausted my strength, I fell a heavy inert mass along the side of the tunnel and lost consciousness. Chapter 25. The Whispering Gallery. When at last I came back to a sense of life and being, my face was wet, but wet, as I soon knew, with tears. How long this state of insensibility lasted, it is quite impossible for me now to say. I had no means left to me of taking any account of time. Never since the creation of the world had such a solitude as mine existed. I was completely abandoned. After my fall, I lost much blood. I felt myself flooded with the life-giving liquid. My first sensation was perhaps a natural one. Why was I not dead? Because I was alive. There was something left to do. I tried to make up my mind to think no longer. As far as I was able, I drove away all ideas, and utterly overcome by pain and grief, I crouched against the granite wall. I just commenced to feeling the fainting coming on again, and the sensation that this was the last struggle before complete annihilation, when on a sudden, a violent uproar reached my ears. It had some resemblance to the prolonged rumbling voice of thunder, and I clearly distinguished sonorous voices, lost one after the other, in the distant depths of the gulf. Whence came this noise? Naturally, it was to be supposed from new phenomena which were taking places in the bosom of the solid mass of Mother Earth. The explosion of some gaseous vapors that followed some solid, of the granitic or other rock. Again I listened with deep attention. I was extremely anxious to hear if this strange and inexplicable sound was likely to be renewed. A whole quarter of an hour elapsed in painful expectation. Deep and solemn silence reigned in the tunnel, so still that I could hear the beatings of my own heart. I waited with a strange kind of hopefulness. Suddenly my ear, which leaned accidentally against the wall, appeared to catch, as it were, the faintest echo of a sound. I thought that I heard vague, incoherent, and distant voices. I quivered all over with excitement and hope. "It must be hallucination," I cried. "It cannot be, it is not true." But no, listening more attentively, I really did convince myself that what I heard was truly the sound of human voices. To make any meaning out of the sound, however, was beyond my power. I was too weak even to hear distinctly. Still, it was a positive fact that someone was speaking. Of that, I was quite certain. There was a moment of fear. A dread fell upon my soul that it might be my own words brought back to me by a distant echo. Perhaps without knowing it, I might have been crying aloud. I resolutely closed my lips, and once more placed my ear to the huge granite wall. Yes, for certain. It was in truth the sound of human voices. I now, by the exercise of great determination, dragged myself along the sides of the cavern, until I reached a point where I could hear more distinctly. But though I could detect the sound, I could only make out uncertain, strange, and incomprehensible words. They reached my ear as if they had been spoken in a low tone, murmured, as it were, afar off. At last, I made out the word Forlip had repeated several times in a tone betokening great mental anguish and sorrow. What could this word mean, and who was speaking it? It must be either my uncle or the guide Hans. If, therefore, I could hear them, they must surely be able to hear me. "Help!" I cried at the top of my voice. "Help, I'm dying!" I then listened with scarcely a breath. I panted for the slightest sound in the darkness, a cry, a sigh, a question. But silence reigned supreme. No answer came. In this way some minutes passed. A whole flood of ideas flashed through my mind. I began to fear that my voice, weakened by sickness and suffering, could not reach my companions who were in search of me. "It must be they," I cried. "Who else could, by any possibility, be buried 100 miles below the level of the earth?" The mere supposition was preposterous. I began, therefore, to listen again with the most breathless attention. As I moved my ears along the side of the place I was in, I found a mathematical point, as it were, where the voices appeared to attain their maximum of intensity. The word "Forlord" again distinctly reached my ear. Then came again that rolling noise like thunder which had awakened me out of my torpor. "I begin to understand," I said to myself after some little time devoted to reflection. "It is not through the solid mass of my sound reaches my ears. The walls of my cavernous retreat are of solid granite, and the most fearful explosion would not make uproar enough to penetrate them. The sound must come along the gallery itself. The place I was in must possess some peculiar acoustic properties of its own." Again I listened, and this time, yes, this time, I heard my name distinctly pronounced, cast as it were into space. It was my uncle, the professor, who was speaking. He was in conversation with the guide, and the word which had so often reached my ears, "Forlerad," was a Danish expression. Then I understood it all. In order to make myself heard, I too must speak as if it were along the side of the gallery, which would carry the sound of my voice just as the wire carries the electric fluid from point to point. But there was no time to lose. If my companions were only to remove a few feet from where they stood, the acoustic effect would be over. My whispering gallery would be destroyed. I again therefore crawled towards the wall, and said as clearly and distinctly as I could, "Uncle Hardwigg." I then awaited a reply. Sound does not possess the property of traveling with such extreme rapidity. Besides, the density of the air at that depth from light and motion was very far from adding to the rapidity of circulation. Several seconds elapsed, which to my excited imagination appeared ages, and these words reached my eager ears and moved my wildly beating heart. "Harry, my boy, is that you?" A short delay between question and answer. "Yes, yes. Where are you?" "Lost." "And your lamp?" "Out. But the guiding stream is lost." "Keep your courage, Harry. We will do our best." "One moment, my uncle," I cried. "I have no longer strength to answer your questions, but for heaven's sake, do you continue to speak to me." Absolute silence, I felt, would be annihilation. "Keep up your courage," said my uncle. "As you are so weak, do not speak. We have been searching for you in all directions, both by going upwards and downwards in the gallery. My dear boy, I have begun to give over all hope, and you can never know what bitter tears of sorrow and regret I have shed. At last, supposing you to be still on the road beside the Hornbach, we again descended, firing off guns as signals. Now, however, that we have found you, and that your voice reaches each other, it may be a long time before we actually meet. We are conversing by means of some extraordinary acoustic arrangement of the labyrinth. But do not despair, my dear boy. It is something gained even to hear each other." While he was speaking, my brain was at work reflecting. A certain undefined hope, vague and shapeless as yet, made my heart beat wildly. In the first place, it was absolutely necessary for me to know one thing. I once more, therefore, leaned my head against the wall, which I almost touched with my lips, and again spoke. "Uncle." "My boy," was his answer after a few moments. "It is of the utmost consequence that we should know how far we are asunder." "That is not difficult." "You have your chronometer at hand?" I asked. "Certainly." "Well, take it into your hand. Pronounce my name, noting exactly the second at which you speak. I will reply as soon as I hear your words, and you will then note exactly the moment at which my reply reaches to you." "Very good. In the meantime, between my question and your answer will be the time occupied by my voice in reaching you." "That is exactly what I mean, uncle," was my eager reply. "Are you ready?" "Yes." "Well, make ready. I am about to pronounce your name," said the professor. I applied my ear close to the sides of the cavernous gallery, and as soon as the word Harry reached my ear, I turned round and, placing my lips to the wall, repeated the sound. 40 seconds, said my uncle. There has elapsed 40 seconds between the two words. The sound, therefore, takes 20 seconds to ascend. Now, allowing 1,020 feet for every second, we have 20,400 feet, a league and a half and 1/8. These words fell on my soul like a kind of death knell. "A league and a half," I muttered in a low and despairing voice. "It shall be got over, my boy," cried my uncle in a cheery tone. "Depend on us." "But do you know whether to ascend or descend?" I asked faintly enough. "They have to descend, and I will tell you why. You have reached a vast open space, a kind of bare crossroad, from which galleries diverge in every direction. That in which you are now lying must certainly bring you to this point, for it appears that all these mighty fissures, these fractures of the globe's interior, radiate from the vast cavern for which we are now at the moment occupy. Rouse yourself, then. We have courage and continue our route. Walk if you can. If not, drag yourself along. Slide, if nothing else is possible. The slope must be rather rapid, and you will find strong arms to receive you at the end of your journey. Make a start like a good fellow." These words served to rouse some kind of courage in my sinking frame. "Farewell for the present, good uncle. I am about to take my departure. As soon as I start, our voices will cease to commingle. Farewell, then, until we meet again." "Adieu, Harry. Until we say, welcome." Such were the last words which reached my anxious ears, before I commenced my weary and almost hopeless journey. This wonderful and surprising conversation which took place through the vast mass of the earth's labyrinth, these words exchanged, the speakers being about 5 miles apart, ended with hopeful and pleasant expressions. I breathed one more prayer to heaven. I sent up words of thanksgiving, believing in my inmost heart that he had led me to the only place where the voices of my friends could reach my ears. This apparently astounding acoustic mystery is easily explainable by simple natural laws. It arose from the conductibility of the rock. There are many instances of the singular propagation of sound which are not perceptible in its less immediate positions. In the interior gallery of St. Paul's, and amid the curious caverns in Sicily, these phenomena are observable. The most marvelous of them all is known as the ear of Dionysus. These memories of the past, of my early reading and studies, came fresh to my thoughts. Moreover, I began to reason that if my uncle and I could communicate at so great a distance, no serious obstacle could exist between us. All I had to do was to follow the direction whence the sound had reached me, and logically putting it, I must reach him if my strength did not fail. I accordingly rose to my feet. I soon found, however, that I could not walk, that I must drag myself along. The slope, as I expected, was very rapid, but I allowed myself to slip down. Such the rapidity of the descent began to assume frightful proportions, and menaced a fearful fall. I clutched at the sides. I grasped at the projections of rocks. I threw myself backwards. All in vain. My weakness was so great I could do nothing to save myself. Suddenly, earth failed me. I was at first launched into a dark and gloomy void. I then struck against the projecting asperities of a vertical gallery, a perfect well, my head bounding against a pointed rock, and I lost all knowledge of existence. As far as I was concerned, death had claimed me for his own. Chapter 26. A Rapid Recovery. When I returned to the consciousness of existence, I found myself surrounded by a kind of semi-obscurity, lying on some thick and soft coverlets. My uncle was watching, his eyes fixed intently on my countenance, a grave expression on his face, a tear in his eye. At the first sigh which struggled from my bosom, he took hold of my hand. When he saw my eyes open and fix themselves upon his, he uttered a loud cry of joy. "He lives! He lives!" Yes, my good uncle," I whispered. "My dear boy," continued the grim professor, clasping me to his heart, "you are saved!" I was deeply and unaffectedly touched by the tone in which these words were uttered, and even more by the kindly care which accompanied them. The professor, however, was one of those men who must be severely tried in order to induce any display of affection or gentle emotion. At this moment our friend Hans, the guide, joined us. He saw my hand in that of my uncle, and I ventured to say that, taciturn as he was, his eyes beamed with lively satisfaction. "Good dog," he said. "Good day, Hans. Good day," I replied, in as hearty a tone as I could assume. "And now, uncle, that we are together, tell me where we are. I have lost all idea of our position, as of everything else." "Tomorrow, Harry, tomorrow," he replied. "Today you are far too weak. Your head is surrounded by bandages and poultices that must not be touched. Sleep, my boy, sleep. And tomorrow you will know all that you require." "But," I cried, "let me know what o'clock it is, what day it is." "It is now 11 o'clock at night, and this is once more Sunday. It is now the 9th of the month of August, and I distinctly prohibit you from asking any more questions until the 10th of the same." I was, if the truth were told, very weak indeed, and my eyes soon closed involuntarily. I did require a good night's rest, and I went off reflecting at the last moments that my perilous adventure in the interior of the earth, in total darkness, had lasted 4 days. On the morning of the next day, at my awakening, I began to look around me. My sleeping place, made of all our travel bedding, was in a charming grotto, adorned with magnificent stalagmites, glittering in all the colors of the rainbow, the floor of soft and silvery sand. A dim obscurity prevailed. No torch, no lamp was lighted, and yet certain unexplained beams of light penetrated from without, and made their way through the opening of the beautiful grotto. I, moreover, heard a vague and indefinite murmur, like the ebb and flow of waves upon a strand, and sometimes I verily believed I could hear the sighing of the wind. I began to believe that, instead of being awake, I must be dreaming. Surely my brain had not been affected by my fall, and all that occurred during the last 24 hours was not the frenzied visions of madness. And yet, after some reflection, a trial of my faculties, I came to the conclusion I could not be mistaken. Eyes and ears could not surely both deceive me. It is a ray of the blessed daylight, I said to myself, which has penetrated through some mighty fissure in the rocks. But what is the meaning of this murmur of waves, this unmistakable moaning of the salt sea billows? I can hear too plainly enough the whistling of the wind. But can I be altogether mistaken? If my uncle during my illness has but carried me back to the surface of the earth, has he on my account given up his wondrous expedition, or in some strange manner has it come to an end? I was puzzling my brain over these and other questions when the professor joined me. "Good day, Harry," he cried in a joyous tone. "I fancy you are quite well." "I am very much better," I replied, actually sitting up in my bed. "I knew that would be the end of it, as you slept both soundly and tranquilly. Hans and I have each taken turn to watch, and every hour we have seen visible signs of amelioration." "You must be right, uncle," was my reply, "for I feel as if I could do justice to any meal you could put before me." "You shall eat, my boy, you shall eat. The fever has left you. Our excellent friend Hans has rubbed your wounds and bruises, which I know not what ointment, of which the Icelanders alone possess the secret, and they have healed your bruises in the most marvelous manner. Ah, what a wise fellow is Mr. Hans." While he was speaking, my uncle was placing before me several articles of food, which, despite his earnest injunctions, I readily devoured. As soon as the first rage of hunger was appeased, I overwhelmed him with questions, to which he now no longer hesitated to give answers. I then learned for the first time that my providential fall had brought me to the bottom of an almost perpendicular gallery. As I came down, amidst a perfect shower of stones, the least of which falling on me would have crushed me to death, they came to the conclusion that I had carried with me an entire dislocated rock. Riding as it were on this terrible chariot, I was cast headlong into my uncle's arms, and into them I fell, insensible and covered with blood. "It is indeed a miracle," was the professor's final remark, "that you were not killed 1,000 times over. But let us take care never to separate, for surely we should risk never meeting again." "Let us take care never again to separate." These words fell with a sort of chill upon my heart. The journey then was not over. I looked at my uncle with surprise and astonishment. My uncle, after an instant's examination of my countenance, said, "What is the matter, Harry? I want to ask you a very serious question. You say that I am all right in health." "Certainly you are." "And that all my limbs are sound and capable of new exertion?" I asked. "Most undoubtedly." "But what about my head?" was my next anxious question. "Well, your head, except that you have 1 or 2 contusions, is exactly where it ought to be, on your shoulders," said my uncle, laughing. "Well, my own opinion is that my head is not exactly right. In fact, I believe myself slightly delirious." "What makes you think so?" "I will explain why I fancy I have lost my senses," I cried. "Have we not returned to the surface of Mother Earth?" "Certainly not." "Then truly I must be mad, for do I not see the light of day? Do I not hear the whistling of the wind, and can I not distinguish the wash of a great sea?" "And that is all that makes you uneasy?" said my uncle with a smile. "Can you explain?" "I will not make any attempt to explain, for the whole matter is utterly inexplicable. But you shall see and judge for yourself. You will then find that geological science is yet in its infancy, and that we are doomed to enlighten the world." "Let us advance, then," I cried eagerly, no longer able to restrain my curiosity. "Wait a moment, my dear Henry," he responded. "You must take precautions after your illness before going into the open air." "The open air?" "Yes, my boy. I have to warn you that the wind is rather violent, and I have no wish for you to expose yourself without necessary precautions." "But I beg to assure you that I am perfectly recovered from my illness." "Have just a little patience, my boy. A relapse would be an inconvenience to all parties. We have no time to lose, as our approaching sea voyage may be of long duration." "Sea voyage?" I cried, more bewildered than ever. "Yes. You must take another day's rest, and we shall be ready to go on board by tomorrow," replied my uncle with a peculiar smile. Go on board? The words utterly astonished me. Go on board? What and how? Had we come upon a river, a lake? Had we discovered some inland sea? Was a vessel lying at anchor in some part of the interior of the earth? My curiosity was worked up to the very highest pitch. My uncle had made vain attempts to restrain me. When at last, however, he discovered that my feverish impatience would do more harm than good, and that the satisfaction of my wishes could alone restore me to a calm state of mind, he gave way. I dressed myself rapidly, and then taking the precaution to please my uncle of wrapping myself in one of the coverlets, I rushed out of the grotto. Chapter 27. The Central Sea. At first I saw absolutely nothing. My eyes, wholly unused to the effulgence of light, could not bear the sudden brightness, and I was compelled to close them. When I was able to reopen them, I stood still, far more stupefied than astonished. Not all the wildest effects of imagination could have conjured up such a scene. "The sea! The sea!" I cried. "Yes," replied my uncle in a tone of pardonable pride. "The Central Sea. No future navigator will deny the fact of my having discovered it, and hence of acquiring a right to giving it a name." It was quite true. A vast, limitless expanse of water, the end of a lake if not of an ocean, spread before us until it was lost in the distance. The shore, which was very much indented, consisted of a beautiful soft golden sand, mixed with small shells, the long deserted home of some of the creatures of a past age. The waves broke incessantly, and with a peculiarly sonorous murmur, to be found in underground localities. A slight frothy flake rose as the wind blew along the pellucid waters, and many a dash of spray was blown into my face. The mighty superstructure of rock which rose above to an inconceivable height left only a narrow opening, but where we stood, there was a large margin of strand. On all sides were capes and promontories and enormous cliffs, partially worn by the eternal breaking of the waves through countless ages. And as I gazed from side to side, the mighty rocks faded away like a fleecy film of cloud. It was in reality an ocean, with all the usual characteristics of an inland sea, only horribly wild, so rigid, cold, and savage. One thing startled and puzzled me greatly. How was it that I was able to look upon that vast sheet of water, instead of being plunged into utter darkness? The vast landscape before me was lit up like day, but there was wanting the dazzling brilliancy, the splendid irradiation of the sun, the pale cold illumination of the moon, the brightness of the stars, the illuminating power in the subterranean region, from its trembling and rickering character, its clear dry whiteness, the very slight elevation of its temperature, its great superiority to that of the moon, was evidently electric, something in the nature of the aurora borealis, only that its phenomena were constant and able to light up the whole of the ocean cavern. The tremendous vault above our heads, the sky, so to speak, appeared to be composed of a conglomeration of nebulous vapors in constant motion. I should originally have supposed that, under such an atmospheric pressure as much exists in that place, the evaporation of water could not really take place, and yet from the action of some physical law, which escaped my memory, there were heavy and dense clouds rolling along that mighty vault, partially concealing the roof. Electric currents produced astonishing play of light and shade in the distance, especially around the heavier clouds. Deep shadows were cast beneath, and suddenly between two clouds, there would come a ray of unusual beauty and remarkable intensity. And yet it was not like the sun, for it gave no heat. The effect was sad and excruciatingly melancholy. Instead of a noble firmament of blue, studded with stars, there was above me a heavy roof of granite which seemed to crush me. Gazing around, I began to think of the theory of the English captain, who compared the earth to a vast hollow sphere in the interior, of which the air is retained in a luminous state by means of atmospheric pressure, while two stars, Pluto and Proserpine, circled there in their mysterious orbits. After all, suppose the old fellow was right. In truth, we were imprisoned, bound, as it were, in a vast excavation. Its width was impossible to make out. The shore, on either hand, widening rapidly until lost to sight, while its length was equally uncertain. A haze on the distant horizon bounded our view. As to its height, we could see that it must be many miles to the roof. Looking upward, it was impossible to discover where the stupendous roof began. The lowest of the clouds must have been floating at an elevation of 2,000 yards, a height greater than that of terrestrial vapors, which circumstance was doubtless owing to the extreme density of the air. I use the word cavern in order to give an idea of the place. I cannot describe its awful grandeur. Human language fails to convey any idea of its savage sublimity. Whether this singular vacuum had or had not been caused by the sudden cooling of the earth when in a state of fusion, I could not say. I had read of the most wonderful and gigantic caverns, but none in any way like this. The great grotto of Guachara in Colombia, visited by the learned Humboldt, the vast and partially explored Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. What were these holes in the earth to that in which I stood in speechless admiration, with its vapory clouds, its electrical light, and the mighty ocean slumbering in its bosom? Imagination, not description, can alone give an idea of the splendor and vastness of the cave. I gazed at these marvels in profound silence. Words were utterly wanting to indicate the sensations of wonder I experienced. I seemed, as I stood upon that mysterious shore, as if I were some wandering inhabitant of a distant planet, present for the first time at the spectacle of some terrestrial phenomena belonging to another existence. To give body and existence to such new sensations would have required the coinage of new words. And here my feeble brain found itself wholly at fault. I looked on, I thought, I reflected, I admired, in a state of stupefaction not altogether unmingled with fear. The unexpected spectacle restored some color to my pallid cheeks. I seemed to be actually getting better under the influence of this novelty. Moreover, the vivacity of the dense atmosphere reanimated my body by inflating my lungs with unaccustomed oxygen. It will be readily conceived that after an imprisonment of 47 days, in a dark and miserable tunnel, it was with infinite delight that I breathed this saline air. It was like the genial, reviving influence of the salt sea waves. My uncle had already got over the first surprise. With the Latin poet Horace, his idea was that, not to admire is all the art I know, to make man happy and to keep him so. "Well," he said, after giving me some time thoroughly to appreciate the marvels of this underground sea, "do you feel strong enough to walk up and down?" "Certainly," was my ready answer. "Nothing would give me greater pleasure." "Well then, my boy," he said, "lean on my arm, and we will stroll along the beach." I accepted his offer eagerly, and we began to walk along the shores of this extraordinary lake. To our left were abrupt rocks, piled one upon the other, a stupendous titanic pile. Down their sides leaped innumerable cascades, which at last, becoming limpid and murmuring streams, were lost in the waters of the lake. Light vapors which rose here and there, and floated in fleecy clouds from rock to rock, indicated hot springs, which also poured their superfluity into the vast reservoir at our feet. Among them I recognized our old and faithful stream, the Hansbach, which, lost in that wild basin, seemed as if it had been flowing since the creation of the world. "We shall miss our excellent friend," I remarked, with a deep sigh. "Bah!" said my uncle testily. "What matters it? That or another, it is all the same." I thought the remark ungrateful, and felt almost inclined to say so, but I forbore. At this moment my attention was attracted by an unexpected spectacle. After we had gone about 500 yards, we suddenly turned a steep promontory, and found ourselves close to a lofty forest. It consisted of straight trunks with tufted tops, in shape like parasols. The air seemed to have no effect upon these trees, which in spite of a tolerable breeze remained as still and motionless as if they had been petrified. I hastened forward. I could find no name for these singular formations. Did they not belong to the 2,000 and more known trees? Or were we to make the discovery of a new growth? By no means. When we at last reached the forest and stood beneath the trees, my surprise gave way to admiration. In truth, I was simply in the presence of a very ordinary product of the earth, of singular and gigantic proportions. My uncle, unhesitatingly, called them by their real names. "It is only," he said in his coolest manner, "a forest of mushrooms." On close examination I found that he was not mistaken. Judge of the development attained by their product of damp hot soils. I had heard that the Lycoperdon giganteum reaches 9 feet in circumference, but here were white mushrooms nearly 40 feet high, and with tops of equal dimensions. They grew in countless thousands. The light could not make its way through their massive substance, and beneath them reigned a gloomy and mystic darkness. Still, I wished to go forward. The cold in the shades of the singular forest was intense. For nearly an hour we wandered about in this visible darkness. At length I left the spot, and once more returned to the shores of the lake, to light and comparative warmth. But the amazing vegetation of subterraneous land was not confined to gigantic mushrooms. New wonders awaited us at every step. We had not gone many hundred yards when we came upon a mighty group of other trees with discolored leaves. The common humble trees of Mother Earth, of an exorbitant and phenomenal size. Lycopods 100 feet high, flowering ferns as tall as pines, gigantic grasses. "Astonishing, magnificent, splendid!" cried my uncle. "Here we have before us the whole flora of the second period of the world, that of transition. Behold the humble plants of our gardens, which in the first ages of the world were mighty trees. Look around you, my dear Harry. No botanist ever before gazed at such a sight." My uncle's enthusiasm, always a little more than was required, was now excusable. "You are right, uncle," I remarked. "Providence appears to have designed the preservation in this vast and mysterious hothouse of antediluvian plants, to prove the sagacity of learned men in figuring them so marvelously on paper." "Well said, my boy, very well said. It is indeed a mighty hothouse. But you would also be within the bounds of reason and common sense, if you added that it was also a vast menagerie." I looked rather anxiously around. If the animals were as exaggerated as the plants, the matter would certainly be serious. "A menagerie? Doubtless. Look at the dust we are treading underfoot. Behold the bones with which the whole soil of the seashore is covered." "Bones," I replied. "Yes, certainly, the bones of antediluvian animals." I stooped down as I spoke, and picked up one or two singular remains, relics of a bygone age. It was easy to give a name to these gigantic bones, in some instances as big as trunks of trees. "Here's clearly the lower jawbone of a mastodon," I cried, almost as warmly and enthusiastically as my uncle. "Here are the molars of the Dinotherium. Here's a leg bone which belonged to the Megatherium. You are right, uncle. It is indeed a menagerie. For the mighty animals to which these bones once belonged have lived and died on the shores of the subterranean sea, under the shadows of these plants. Look, yonder are whole skeletons, and yet—" "And yet, nephew?" said my uncle, noticing that I suddenly came to a full stop. "I do not understand the presence of such beasts in granite caverns, however vast and prodigious," was my reply. "Why not?" said my uncle, with very much of his old professional impatience. "Because it is well known that animal life only existed on Earth during the secondary period, when the sedimentary soil was formed by the alluviums, and thus replaced the hot and burning rocks of the primitive age. I have listened to you earnestly and with patience, Harry, and I have a simple and clear answer to your objections, and that is, that this itself is sedimentary soil." "How can that be at such enormous depth from the surface of the Earth?" "The fact can only be explained both simply and geologically. At a certain period, the Earth consisted only of an elastic crust, liable to alternative upward and downward moments in virtue of the law of attraction. It is very probable that many a landslip took place in those days, and that large portions of sedimentary soil were cast into huge and mighty chasms." "Quite possible," I dryly remarked. "But, uncle, if these antediluvian animals formerly lived in these subterranean regions, what more likely than that one of those monsters may at this moment be concealed behind one of yonder mighty rocks?" As I spoke, I looked keenly around, examining with care every point of the horizon. But nothing alive appeared to exist on these deserted shores. I now felt rather fatigued, and told my uncle so. The walk and excitement were too much for me in my weak state. I therefore seated myself at the end of a promontory, at the foot of which the waves broke in incessant rolls. I looked round a bay formed by projections of vast granitic rocks. At the end was a little port projected by huge pyramids of stones. A brig and 3 or 4 schooners might have lain there with perfect ease. So natural did it seem that every minute my imagination induced me to expect a vessel, coming out under all sail and making for the open sea, under the influence of a warm southerly breeze. But the fantastic illusion never lasted more than a minute. We were the only living creatures in the subterranean world. During certain periods there was an utter cessation of wind, when a silence deeper, more terrible than the silence of the desert, fell upon these solitary and arid rocks, and seemed to hang like a leaden weight upon the waters of the singular ocean. I sought, amid the awful stillness, to penetrate through the distant fog, to tear down the veil which concealed the mysterious distance. What unspoken words were murmured by my trembling lips? What questions did I wish to ask and did not? Where did the sea end? To what did it lead? Should we ever be able to examine its distant shores? But my uncle had no doubts about the matter. He was convinced that our enterprise would in the end be successful. For my part, I was in a state of painful indecision. I desired to embark on the journey and to succeed, and still I feared the result. After we had passed an hour or more in silent contemplation of the wondrous spectacle, we rose and went down towards the bank on our way to the grotto, which I was sorry not to gain. After a slight repast, I sought refuge in slumber, and at length, after many and tedious struggles, sleep came over my weary eyes. Chapter 28. Launching the Raft. On the morning of the next day, to my great surprise, I awoke completely restored. I thought a bath would be delightful after my long illness and sufferings. So soon after rinsing, I went and plunged into the waters of this new Mediterranean. The bath was cool, fresh, and invigorating. I came back to breakfast with an excellent appetite. Hans, our worthy guide, thoroughly understood how to cook such eatables as we were able to provide. He had both fire and water at discretion, so he was enabled slightly to vary the weary monotony of our ordinary repast. Our morning meal was like a capital English breakfast, with coffee by way of a wind-up, and never had this delicious beverage been so welcome and refreshing. My uncle had sufficient regard for my state of health not to interrupt me in the enjoyment of my meal, but he was evidently delighted when I had finished. "Now then," said he, "come with me. It is the height of the tide, and I am anxious to study its curious phenomena." "What?" I cried, rising in astonishment. "Did you say the tide, uncle?" "Certainly I did." "You do not mean to say," I replied in a tone of respectful doubt, "that the influence of the sun and moon is felt here below." "And pray why not? Are not all bodies influenced by the law of universal attraction? Why should this vast underground sea be exempt from the general law, the rule of the universe? Besides, there is nothing like that which is proved and demonstrated. Despite the great atmospheric pressure down here, you will notice that this inland sea rises and falls, with as much regularity as the Atlantic itself." As my uncle spoke, we reached the sandy shore, and saw and heard the waves breaking monotonously on the beach. They were evidently rising. "This is truly the flood," I cried, looking at the water at my feet. "Yes, my excellent nephew," replied my uncle, rubbing his hands with the gusto of a philosopher. "And you see why these several streaks of foam as the tide rises at least 10 or 12 feet. It is indeed marvelous." "By no means," he responded. "On the contrary, it is quite natural." "It may appear so in your eyes, my dear uncle," was my reply. "But all the phenomena of the place appear to me to partake of the marvelous. It is almost impossible to believe that which I see. Who in his wildest dreams could have imagined that, beneath the crust of our earth, there could exist a real ocean with ebbing and flowing tides, with its change of winds and even its storms? I for one should have laughed the suggestion to scorn." "But Harry, my boy, why not?" inquired my uncle with a pitying smile. "Is there any physical reason in opposition to it?" "Well, if we give up the great theory of the central heat of the earth, I certainly can offer no reasons why anything should be looked upon as impossible." "Then you will own," he added, "that the system of Sir Humphrey Davy is wholly justified by what we have seen." "I allow that it is. And that point once granted, I certainly can see no reason for doubting the existence of seas and other wonders, even countries, in the interior of the globe." "That is so, but of course these very countries are uninhabited." "Well, I grant that it is more likely than not. I do not see why the sea should have given shelter to some species of unknown fish." "Hitherto, we have not discovered any, and the probabilities are rather against our ever doing so," observed the professor. I was losing my skepticism in the presence of these wonders. "Well, I am determined to solve the question. It is my intention to try my luck with my fishing line and hook." "Certainly, make the experiment," said my uncle, pleased with my enthusiasm. "While we are about it, it will certainly be only proper to discover all the secrets of this extraordinary region." "But after all, where are we now?" I asked. "All this time I have quite forgotten to ask you a question which, doubtless, your philosophical instruments have long since answered." "Well," replied the professor, Examining the situation from only one point of view, we are now distant 350 leagues from Iceland. So much? Was my exclamation. I have gone over the matter several times, and am not sure to have made a mistake of 500 yards, replied my uncle positively. And as to the direction, are we still going to the southeast? Yes, with the western declination of 19 degrees 42 minutes just as it is above. As for the inclination, I have discovered a very curious fact. What might that be, uncle? Your information interests me. Why, as a needle, instead of dipping towards the pole as it does on Earth, in the northern hemisphere has an upward tendency. This proves, I cried, that the great point of magnetic attraction lies somewhere between the surface of the Earth and the spot we have succeeded in reaching. Exactly, my observant nephew, exclaimed my uncle, elated and delighted, and it is quite probable that if we succeed in getting toward the polar regions, somewhere near the 73rd degree of latitude, where Sir James Ross discovered the magnetic pole, we shall behold the needle point directly upward. We have therefore discovered by analogy that this great center of attraction is not situated at a very great depth. Well, said I, rather surprised, this discovery will astonish experimental philosophers. It was never suspected. Science, great, mighty, and the earth unerring, replied my uncle dogmatically. Science has fallen into many errors which have been fortunate and useful rather than otherwise, for they have been the stepping stones to truth. After some further discussion, I turned to another matter. Have you any idea of the depth we have reached? We are now, continued the professor, exactly 35 leagues, about 100 miles, down into the interior of the earth. So, said I, after measuring the distance of the map, we are now beneath the Scottish Highlands, and have over our heads the lofty Grampian Hills. You are quite right, said the professor, laughing. It sounds very alarming, the weight being heavy, but the vault which supports the vast mass of earth and rock is solid and safe. The mighty architect of the universe has constructed it of solid materials. Man, even in his highest flights of vivid and poetic imagination, never thought of such things. What are the finest arches of our bridges, what the vaulted roofs of our cathedrals, to that mighty dome above us, and beneath which floats an ocean with its storms and calms and tides. I admire it all as much as you can, uncle, and have no fear that our granite sky will fall upon our heads. But now that we have discussed matters of science and discovery, what are your future intentions? Are you not thinking of getting back to the surface of our beautiful Earth? This was said more as a feeler than with any hope of success. Go back, nephew, cried my uncle in a tone of alarm. You are not surely thinking of anything so absurd or cowardly. No, my intention is to advance and continue our journey. We have as yet been singularly fortunate, and henceforth I hope we shall be more so. But, said I, how are we to cross yonder liquid plain? It is not my intention to leap into it head foremost, or even to swim across it, like Leander over the Hellespont. But as oceans are, after all, only great lakes, inasmuch as they are surrounded by land, so does it stand to reason that this central sea is circumscribed by granite surroundings. Doubtless, was my natural reply. Well then, do you not think that when once we reach the other end, we shall find some means of continuing our journey? Probably, but what extent do you allow to this infernal ocean? Well, I should fancy it to extend about 40 or 50 leagues, more or less. By even supposing this approximation to be a correct one, what then? I asked. My dear boy, we have no time for further discussion. We shall embark tomorrow. I looked around with surprising incredulity. I could see nothing in the shape of boat or vessel. What? I cried. We are about to launch upon an unknown sea, and where, if I may ask, is the vessel to carry us? Well, my dear boy, it is not to be exactly what you would call a vessel. For the present, we must be content with a good and solid raft. Oh, raft! I cried incredulously. But down here a raft is as impossible of construction as a vessel, and I am at loss to imagine. My good Harry, if you were to listen instead of talking so much, you would hear, said my uncle, waxing a little impatient. I should hear? Yes, Sir Knox with a hammer, which Hans is now employing to make the raft. He has been at work for many hours. Making a raft? Yes. But where has he found trees suitable for such a construction? He found the trees already to his hand, Come, and you shall see our excellent guided work. More and more amazed at what I heard and saw, I followed my uncle like one in a dream. After a walk of about a quarter of an hour, I saw Hans at work on the other side of the promontory which formed our natural port. A few minutes more and I was beside him. To my great surprise, on the sandy shore lay a half-finished raft. It was made from beams of a very peculiar wood, and a great number of limbs, joints, botts, and pieces lay about, sufficient to have constructed a fleet of ships and boats. I turned to my uncle, silent with astonishment and awe. "Where did all this wood come from?" I cried. "What wood is it?" "Well, there's pine wood, fir, and the palms of the northern regions, mineralized by the actions of the sea," he replied sententiously. "Can it be possible?" "Yes," said the learned professor. "What you see now is called fossil wood." "But then," cried I, after reflecting for a moment, "like the lignites, it must be as hard and as heavy as iron, and therefore most certainly not float." "Sometimes that is the case. Many of these woods have become to anthracites, but other again, like those you see before you, have only undergone one phase of fossil transformation. But there is no proof like demonstration," added my uncle, picking one or two of these precious waifs and casting them into the sea. The piece of wood, after having disappeared for a moment, came to the surface, and floated about with the oscillation produced by wind and tide. "Are you convinced?" said my uncle with a self-satisfied smile. "I am convinced," I cried, "that what I see is incredible." The fact was that my journey into the interior of the earth was rapidly changing all preconceived notions, and day by day preparing me for the marvelous. I should not have been surprised to have seen a fleet of native canoes afloat upon that silent sea. The very next morning, thanks to the industry and ability of Hans, the raft was finished. It was about 10 feet long and 5 feet wide. The beams, bound together with stout ropes, were solid and firm, and once launched by our united efforts, the improvised vessel floated tranquilly upon the waters of what the professor had well named the Central Sea. Chapter 29. On the Waters, a Raft Voyage. On the 13th of August we were up betimes. There was no time to be lost. We now had to inaugurate a new kind of locomotion, which would have the advantage of being rapid and not fatiguing. A mast made of 2 pieces of wood fashioned together. To give additional strength, a yard made from another one. The sail, a linen sheet from our bed. We were fortunately in no want of cordage, and the hull on trial appeared solid and seaworthy. At 6 o'clock in the morning, when the eager and enthusiastic professor gave the signal to embark, the victuals, the luggage, all our instruments, our weapons, and a goodly supply of sweet water, which we had collected from springs in the rocks, were placed on the raft. Hans had, with considerable ingenuity, contrived a rudder, which enabled him to guide the floating apparatus with ease. He took the tiller as a matter of course. The worthy man was as good a sailor as he was a guide and duck hunter. I then let go the painter which held us to the shore. The sail was brought to the wind, and we made a rapid offing. Our sea voyage had at length commenced, and once more we were making for distant and unknown regions. Just as we were about to leave the little port where the raft had been constructed, my uncle, who was very strong as to geographic nomenclature, wanted to give it a name, and among others suggested mine. "Well," said I, "before you decide, I have another to propose." "Well outfitted." "I should like to call it Gretchen. Port Gretchen will sound very well on our future map." "Well then, Port Gretchen let it be," said the professor. And thus it was that the memory of my dear girl was attached to our adventurous and memorable expedition. When we left the shore, the wind was blowing from the northward and eastward. We went directly before the wind at a much greater speed than might have been expected from a raft. The dense layers of atmosphere at that depth had great propelling power, and acted upon the sail with considerable force. At the end of an hour, my uncle, who had been taking careful observations, was enabled to judge of the rapidity with which we moved. It was far beyond anything seen in the upper world. "If," he said, "we continue to advance at our present rate, we shall have traveled at least 30 leagues in 24 hours. With a mere raft, this is an almost incredible velocity." I certainly was surprised, and without making any reply, went forward upon the raft. Already the northern shore was fading away on the edge of the horizon. The two shores appeared to separate more and more, leaving a wide and open space for our departure. Before me, I could see nothing but the vast and apparently limitless sea, upon which we floated, the only living objects in sight. Huge and dark clouds cast their gray shadows above, shadows which seemed to crush that colorless and sullen water by their weight. Anything more suggestive of gloom and of regions of nether darkness I never beheld. Silvery rays of electric light, reflected here and there upon some small spots of water, brought up luminous sparkles in the long wake of our cumbrous bark. Presently we were wholly out of sight of land. Not a vestige could be seen, nor any indication of where we were going. But still and motionless did we seem, without taking any distant point to fix our eyes on that. But for the phosphoric light at the wake of the raft, I should have fancied that we were still and motionless. But I knew that we were advancing at a very rapid rate. About 12 o'clock in the day, vast collections of seaweed were discovered surrounding us on all sides. I was aware of the extraordinary vegetative power of these plants, which had been known to creep along the bottom of the great ocean and stop the advance of large ships. But never were seaweeds ever seen, so gigantic and wonderful as those on the Central Sea. I could well imagine now, seen at a distance, tossing and heaving on the summit of the billows, the long lines of algae had been taking for living things, and thus had been fertile sources of the belief in sea serpents. Our raft swept past great specimens of fucus, or sea wrack, from 3,000 to 4,000 feet in length, immense, incredibly long, looking like snakes that stretched out far beyond our horizon. It afforded me great amusement to gaze on their variegated ribbon-like endless lengths. Hour after hour passed without our coming to the termination of these floating weeds. If my astonishment increased, my patience was well nigh exhausted. What natural force could possibly have produced such abnormal and extraordinary plants? What must have been the aspect of the globe during the first centuries of its formation, when under the combined action of heat and humidity, the vegetable kingdom occupied its vast surface to the exclusion of everything else? These were considerations of never-ending interest for the geologist and the philosopher. All this while we were advancing on our journey, and at length night came. But as I had remarked the evening before, the luminous state of the atmosphere was in nothing diminished. Whatever was the cause, it was a phenomenon upon the duration of which we could calculate with certainty. As soon as our supper had been disposed of, and some little speculative conversation indulged in, I stretched myself at the foot of the mast, and presently went to sleep. Hans remained motionless at the tiller, allowing the raft to rise and fall on the waves. The wind being aft, and the sail square, all he had to do was to keep his oar in the center. Ever since he had taken our departure from the newly named Port Gretchen, my worthy uncle had directed me to keep a regular log of our day's navigations, with instructions to put down even the most minute particulars, every interesting and curious phenomenon, the direction of the wind, our rate of sailing, the distance we went. In a word, every incident of our extraordinary voyage. From our log, therefore, I tell you the story of our voyage on the Central Sea. Friday, August 14th. A steady breeze from the northwest. Raft progressing with extreme rapidity, and going perfectly straight. Coast still dimly visible about 30 leagues to leeward. Nothing to be seen beyond the horizon in front. The extraordinary intensity of the light neither increases nor diminishes. It is singularly stationary. The weather remarkably fine, that is to say, the clouds have ascended very high, and are light and fleecy, and surrounded by an atmosphere resembling silver in fusion. Thermometer, 32 degrees centigrade. About 12 o'clock in the day, our guide Hans, having prepared and baited a hook, cast his line into the subterranean waters. The bait he used was a small piece of meat, by means of which he concealed his hook. Anxious as I was for a long time doomed to disappoint. Were these waters supplied with fish or not? That was the important question. No, was my decided answer. Then there came a sudden and rather hard tug. Hans coolly drew it in, and with it a fish, which struggled violently to escape. "A fish!" cried my uncle. "It is a sturgeon!" I cried. "Certainly a small sturgeon." The professor examined the fish carefully, noting every characteristic, and he did not coincide with my opinion. The fish was a flathead, round body, and the lower extremities covered with bony scales. Its mouth was wholly without teeth. The pectoral fins, which were highly developed, sprouted directly from the body, which properly speaking had no tail. The animal certainly belonged to the order in which naturalists class the sturgeon, but it differed from that fish in many essential particulars. My uncle, after all, was not mistaken. After a long and patient examination, he said, "This fish, my dear boy, belongs to a family which has been extinct for ages, and of which no trace has ever been found on Earth, except fossil remains in the Devonian strata." "You do not mean to say," I cried, "that we have captured a live specimen of a fish belonging to the primitive stock that existed before the deluge?" "We have," said the professor, who all this time was continuing his observations. "And you may see by careful examination that these fossil fish have no identity with existing species. To hold in one's hands, therefore, a living specimen of this order is enough to make a naturalist happy for life." "But," cried I, "to what family does it belong?" "To the owner of the ganoids, an order of fish having angular scales covered with bright enamel, forming one of the family of the cephalospides, of the genus—" "Well, sir," I remarked, as I noticed my uncle hesitated to conclude. "To the genus Pterochits. Yes, I am certain of it. Though still, I am confident of the correctness of my surmise. This fish offers to our notice a remarkable peculiarity, never known to exist in any other fish, but those who are the natives of subterranean waters, wells, lakes, and caverns, and such like hidden pools. And what might that be? It is blind." "Blind?" I cried, much surprised. "Not only blind," continued the professor, "but absolutely without organs of sight." I now examined our discovery for myself. It was singular, to be sure, but it really was a fact. This, however, might be solitary instance, I suggested. The hook was baited again and once more thrown into the water. This subterranean ocean must have been tolerably well supplied with fish, for in 2 hours we took a large number of pterochits, as well as other fish belonging to other supposed extinct family. The diptertides, a genus of fish furnished with 2 fins only, whence the name, though my uncle could not class it exactly. All without exception, however, were blind. This unexpected catcher enabled us to renew our stock of provisions in a very satisfactory way. We were now convinced that the subterranean sea contained only fish known to us as fossil specimens, and fish and reptiles alike were all the more perfect the farther back they dated their origin. We began to hope that we should find some of those saurians which science has succeeded in reconstructing from bits of bone or cartilage. I took up the telescope and carefully examined the horizon, looked over the whole sea. It was utterly and entirely deserted. Doubtless we were still too near the coast. After an examination of the ocean, I looked upwards, towards a strange and mysterious sky. Why should not one of the birds reconstructed by the immortal Cuvier flap his stupendous wings aloft in the dull strata of subterranean air? It would, of course, find quite sufficient food from the fish in the sea. I gazed for some time upon the void above. It was as silent and as deserted as the shores we had but lately left. Nevertheless, though I could neither see nor discover anything, my imagination carried me away into wild hypotheses. I was in a kind of waking dream. I thought I saw on the surface of the water those enormous antediluvian turtles, as big as floating islands. Upon those dull and somber shores passed a spectral row of the mammifers of early days. The great Leptotherium found in the cavernous hollow of the Brazilian hills. The Mesocotherium, a native of the glacial regions of Siberia. Farther on, the Passotermitous Lophrodon, that gigantic tapir, which concealed itself behind rocks, ready to do battle for its prey, with the Amphiloperium, a singular animal partaking of the nature of the rhinoceros, the horse, the hippopotamus, and the camel. There was a giant mastodon, twisting and turning his horrid trunk, with which he crushed the rocks of the shore to powder, while the Megatherium, his back raised like a cat in a passion, his enormous claws stretched out, dug into the earth for food, and at the same time that he awoke the sonorous echoes of the whole place with his terrible roar. Higher up still, the first monkey ever seen on the face of the globe clambered, gamboling and playing up the granite hills. Still farther away ran the pterodactyl, with the winged hand gliding, or rather, sailing through the dense and compressed air like a huge bat. Above all, near the leaden granitic sky were immense birds, more powerful than the cassowary and the ostrich, which spread their mighty wings and fluttered against the huge stone vault of the inland sea. I thought, such was the effect of my imagination, that I saw this whole tribe of antediluvian creatures. I carried myself back to far ages, long before man existed, when in fact, the earth was in too imperfect a state for him to live upon it. My dream was of countless ages before the existence of man. The mammifers first disappeared, then the mighty birds, then the reptiles of the secondary period, presently the fish, the crustacea, the mollusks, and finally the vertebrata. The zoophytes of the period of transition in their turn sank into annihilation. The whole panorama of the world's life before the historic period seemed to be born over again, and mine was the only human heart that beat in this unpeopled world. There were no more seasons. There were no more climates. The natural heat of the world increased unceasingly, and neutralized that of the great radiant sun. Vegetation was exaggerated in an extraordinary manner. I passed like a shadow in the midst of brushwood as lofty as the giant trees of California, and trod underfoot the moist and humid soil, reeking with a rank and varied vegetation. I leaned against the huge column-like trunks of giant trees, to which those of Canada were as ferns. Whole ages passed. Hundreds upon hundreds of years were concentrated into a single day. Next, unrolled before me like a panorama, came the great and wondrous series of terrestrial transformations. Plants disappeared. The granitic rocks lost all trace of solidity. The liquid state was suddenly substituted for that which had before existed. This was caused by intense heat acting on the organic matter of the earth. The waters flowed over the whole surface of the globe. They boiled, they were volatilized, or turned into vapor. A kind of steam cloud wrapped the whole earth, the globe itself becoming at last nothing but one huge sphere of gas, indescribable in color, between white heat and red, as big and as brilliant as the sun. In the very center of this prodigious mass, 1,400,000 times as large as our globe, I was whirled round in space, and brought into close conjunction with the planets. My body was subtilized, or rather became volatile, and commingled in a state of atomic vapor, with the prodigious clouds, which rushed forward like a mighty comet into infinite space. What an extraordinary dream! Where would it finally take me? My feverish hand began to write down the marvelous details. Details more like the imaginings of a lunatic man than anything sober or real. I had during this period of hallucination forgotten everything. The professor, the guide, and the raft on which we were floating. My mind was in a state of semi-oblivion. "What is the matter, Henry?" said my uncle suddenly. My eyes, which were wide opened, like those of a somnambulist, were fixed upon him, but I did not see him, nor could I clearly make out anything around me. "Take care, my boy," again cried my uncle. "You will fall into the sea." As he uttered these words, I felt myself seized on the other side by the firm hand of our devoted guide. Had it not been for the presence of mind of Hans, I must infallibly have fallen into the waves and been drowned. "Have you gone mad?" cried my uncle, shaking me on the other side. What is the matter?" I said at last, coming to myself. "Are you ill, Henry?" continued the professor in an anxious tone. No. But I have had an extraordinary dream. It, however, has passed away. All now seems well," I added, looking around me with strangely puzzled eyes. "All right," said my uncle. "A beautiful breeze, a splendid sea. We are going along at a rapid rate, and if I am not out of my calculations, we shall soon see land. I shall not be sorry to exchange the narrow limits of our raft for the mysterious strand of the subterranean ocean." As my uncle uttered these words, I rose and carefully scanned the horizon, but the line of water was still confounded with the lowering clouds that hung aloft, and in the distance appeared to touch the edge of the water.